Joe just got elected to the European Parliament, which is like the legislative arm of the EU, taking a seat, in fact, in the main capitalist party of Ireland right now, which is Fianna Fáil, which took a beating from ordinary voters in Ireland for presiding over the economic crisis there. He's also been a deputy in the Dáil, or the Irish Parliament, for 10 years until 2007. And he used the seat to expose the crimes and the failures of the capitalist ruling class of Ireland and to fight for the interests of ordinary workers and youth. When he was a deputy, he only took the salary of the average worker that he represented and gave the rest to the working class and socialist movement. He's been the source of many a headache for the main established political parties in Ireland. He's exposed the exploitation of Turkish immigrant workers who were getting paid 2 to 3 euros an hour when they were supposed to be getting paid like 12 or 13 euros an hour. He's also spent a month in jail for a civil disobedience action protesting against increased garbage collection taxes, which were going to be a burden for working people when the rich got tax breaks. Tonight, that's just a highlight of a few things that he's done. And tonight he'll be speaking on basically the revolt of the working class and youth of Europe against this economic calamity of capitalism, which the Irish ruling elite is attempting to make ordinary working people pay for the crisis that they have created, which is basically the same policy that they're following in the United States, in Britain, in the rest of Europe, and elsewhere. But, I'm sure, a lot of activists that I've talked to in the U.S. here are wondering, when are we going to see, mass protests on the streets? When are we going to see a real reaction to these momentous events? Well, it's going to be instructive for us to look at, basically what's the music of the future for us, which is what's going on in Europe right now, where there's been workplace occupations in Britain and France. There's been boss nappings, where the French workers kidnapping their bosses to make them meet their demands. There's been mass youth protests in Greece, and so on and so forth. And after Joe's finished talking, we'll take questions and comments, and you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. And for more information on Socialist Alternative, you can speak to any one of us after the event. We have a literature table in the back where we have publications that you can look at, our newspaper, Justice, as well as other fine literature. So without further ado, I'll let Joe talk.
You should really wait to the end before cheering, just in case it's not worth your while. So you can judge after you hear. Well, look, I'm Chairman and friends. I am extremely pleased to be on the Labour Movement platform in Minneapolis, which throughout the world is known, of course, as the city of the tremendous battles, especially in the 1930s, where working class people stood up, took on powerful forces of capital in the United States at that time, and set a headline really as to how ordinary workers can organise to defend themselves against the attacks of the employers and the big corporations, and to fight to protect their livelihoods, their jobs, their living standards, and their communities. Now, earlier this morning, at 5 a.m. Irish time, which was about midnight here, about 80 police smashed their way into an office building in downtown Dublin to break up an occupation by workers who were told last Friday that their jobs were gone, that they should leave the premises immediately, and were made an offer of severance or compensation that was an insult to them. The workers occupied the offices immediately and demanded at the very least a decent compensation package, The company is Thomas Cook Travel, which I think some of you might know. It's an international travel agency. It is projected to make $680 million in profits in this year of 2009. And in the last year, its chief executive officer was paid as a salary $12 million. The workers naturally were outraged, but didn't walk away quietly, and immediately sat in and occupied the office, whereupon the bosses went immediately to the High Court to secure injunctions against the workers, which they duly did, ordering them to leave the premises and to allow the employers to have their way. Now, that sacking and the reaction of the workers to it is really indicative of growing tensions, both in Ireland and in other countries in Europe, between the big capitalist corporations and their current tactics in face of the crisis of their system, and the workers, of course, who are the victims of this crisis. Now, when those workers, about 20 in all, were brought in front of a judge this afternoon, the learned judge rather admonished them that whereas he understood that they may have felt that they weren't treated fairly, still he says, we have the law, you have broken the law, and if we allow people to break the law, we will have anarchy. Now, I would have liked to be in the court to remind the learned judge that in Ireland we've had anarchy for many months now, nearly for 12 months in fact, but it hasn't been Irish workers who have been responsible for that anarchy, but big bankers, big speculators, big developers, whose orgy of profiteering and speculation in the property market over a 10-year period created a bubble that has, in the fall of last year, crashed with disastrous consequences for Irish society and for working people in Ireland. A speculative bubble encouraged and legislated for by the Fianna Fáil government, which is the main capitalist party over that time, that distorted the economy, that allowed the property bosses in essence to take control of about 25% of the economy, so that all kinds of taxes and public services became dependent on this bubble, and inevitably when it crashed, as was inevitable of course, it has now created a massive crisis in the Irish economy, giving rise to mass unemployment, which is growing by the month, and to massive attacks on the public services and on the living standards of working people. That is the anarchy that the present system is imposing on Irish society and on working people. But of course, in the minds of the establishment, of the judges who maintain this capitalist law and order, it is only when workers stand up and oppose that that is described as anarchy. Now, they have caused enormous problems, this crisis in Ireland and throughout Europe. But I've spent the last week in San Francisco. I was reading the newspapers and watching the news there, and the parallels really between what is happening in Ireland and what is happening in the United States are quite dramatic. Yesterday I sent a column which I do for every week, once a week, for a daily newspaper called the Daily Mail. I sent it back to Dublin for publication tomorrow. I said that when I arrived in San Francisco I felt very much at home, not so much for the tremendous friendliness and hospitality of the ordinary people of San Francisco, which was very much in evidence, but that I recognised the newspaper headlines immediately, and they might have been the same newspapers that we have had in Dublin over the last 7 months. The San Francisco Chronicle on Wednesday, for example, the headline was that the governor slashes the budget for the Californian state. And the Chronicle, no doubt, is not a socialist newspaper, but I was impressed by how clear and blunt, if you wish, the very first paragraph was, which was that Arnold Schwarzenegger, whom I'm sure you all know very well, and who has, as we see here, moved from being the Terminator in the movie world to the Terminator in real life as far as ordinary Californians are concerned, on Tuesday ended the months-long saga over California's enormous budget deficit, but not before slashing nearly $500 million more, and then it says, from services to the poor, the sick and the elderly. And it really did make for chilling reading to go through some of the proposals for cuts that the Californian working class and the ordinary people are to endure. For example, $14.2 million cut from state parks, which might result in the closure of 100 parks, which of course are an amenity for communities. $6.2 million cut from which eliminates programs that help elderly and disabled people to stay in their own homes. $90 million from the program that serves the elderly, the blind and disabled persons. $16 million cut from help to victims of domestic violence. And incredibly, a cut in health insurance for low-income children that can result in 500,000 extra Californian children being left totally without health cover over the next period of time. Ironic, really, against the debate that is going on in Washington at the present time, considering the health insurance legislation. But obviously a chapter of horrors here going into the next years for the ordinary people, the poor and the working class people in California. Now, in the same front page of the San Francisco Chronicle were two other articles that I could see immediately were related to Schwarzenegger's cuts, but wasn't referred to as being related, if you like, in the Chronicle itself. One about this character Madoff, with the man who created this giant Ponzi scheme for which he is now in jail. Irish people will tell you if he should have come to Ireland and done it there, because he wouldn't be in jail. He'd be going off into the sunset, because we don't jail the banking criminals in Ireland. They get big payoffs and are sent off to a quiet retirement. But in other words, the type of gambling that Madoff was guilty of illegally, but was really a very fine line between it and the legal gambling and the speculation that was going on in the United States, in Ireland and throughout the world on the financial markets, on the subprime mortgage crisis, etc., which of course is exactly what has crashed the economies, which has then resulted in the cutbacks that the Californian people are to endure. And another article that I was quite fascinated by was about Schwarzenegger and a former Democrat governor, I'm sure, Jerry Brown, who have since 2006 raised, in the case of Schwarzenegger, $7.4 million from big corporations for his favourite charities. And Jerry Brown has raised $9.6 million for his favourite charities. Now, he is the Attorney General in California at the present time. And interestingly, $500,000 of Mr. Brown's money for his favourite charities comes from big gambling interests in the state of California. And other contributors were private healthcare companies, land developers, Dow Chemical and Pepsi. So what we have then is a situation for 20 or more years we've had in the United States, mirrored in Europe, of cuts after cuts in the taxation on the major corporations, tax breaks after tax breaks for these and for the property speculators, which now at the first hint of crisis leaves our services massively exposed, leaves working class communities bereft of those services, and then leaves these leading politicians who led the charge against the state services with their hands out to the same corporations, begging for charities for inner city schools, for example in Oakland in the case of Jerry Brown, that of course should be financed from the taxes that these corporations should have paid for the last 20 years. What an incredible contradictory situation our society faces at the present time, after 20 or 25 years of the neoliberal thrust that has been common both to the United States, to Ireland, and to Europe. Now, the Irish Times, which I just have one copy of here, it might as well be the same country, to be honest. Here is billions in savings and 17,000 job cuts proposed by a government review group, and similar to California, states that social welfare, education and health would be the main targets for the cutbacks that they are now planning over the next 3 or 4 years. So we've had in Ireland now this catastrophic collapse after the 10-year splurge of profiteering and speculation in the property market. In the course of that time, the price of an ordinary home for ordinary working people went up in Dublin City 4 times, 400%, leading to a whole generation of young workers in their 20s and 30s now being shackled to mortgages that last for 35 to 40 years, incredibly. Whereas in their parents' day, the maximum would have been 20 years. But now we speak about intergenerational mortgages on an ordinary working class home, where the mortgage will pass on from parents and have to be continued by whichever child might remain in the home. At a time when these massive profiteering was going on, the Irish government halved the taxes on speculators and gave all kinds of further concessions, giving billions and countless billions back to them, just at a time when they were making this enormous killing on the backs of ordinary people in Irish society. And we now have this catastrophic crisis, and of course the system, the establishment, the media are all united in the fact that it is working people and public services that will pay for this crisis. And just like in the United States now, we have a rush to bail out the banks, to put masses of taxpayers' funding into the banks, to bail out the rotten property deals and developers, to try and just protect their system. So we have the same formula in the United States and Ireland, and indeed throughout Europe. And the cost of that, of course, is now massive attacks on public services, on health, on education, the sacking of thousands of teachers in Ireland, which is a small country, 4 million people, the sacking of hundreds of language teachers, for example. We have had a big income of migrant workers from Poland, Eastern Europe, especially other countries, over the last 12 years. Language skills in the grade schools, the primary schools and the secondary schools indeed, is a big issue. Now hundreds of those teachers are to be slashed in response to this crisis. And a huge assault on the living standards, on the wages of ordinary working people. Now the European Union leadership, and the European Union, as you know, is the 27 countries of the kind of western and central part of Europe. But the European Union leadership attempt to portray the European Union as a zone of freedom, of democracy, of people-friendly corporations, not like the bad corporations in the United States who are so greedy, etc., etc., and give us the impression all the time that we should consider ourselves lucky that we were living in Europe, so that we have the blessings of these nice corporations. In fact, the reality is that for the last 20 years, the European Union as an institution has been ruthlessly pushing the same politics of neoliberalism that were pushed in the United States. And if you go back, indeed, it started between the former President Reagan and former British Prime Minister Thatcher in the 1980s. Capitalism is the same, if you like, but neoliberalism was this extra ruthless twist of attacking the idea that business should have social responsibilities. Thatcher's infamous declaration that there is no such thing as society, only individuals, which was the signal for the massive attack on public services, the privatisation of public enterprises, public services, and so forth. And in reality, the European Union and the United States went hand in hand in these kind of policies of privatisation, for example, and on what we call the race to the bottom in terms of the pressure on the wages and the living standards, of workers, the abuse of migrant workers to undercut the established rates of pay and conditions in the labour movement. And in reality, if you read the who's who of European big business, you will recognise many of the names. Nestlé's, Siemens, Heineken's, the armaments industry, for example, the same companies in reality, many of whom are here as well, who form a powerful cartel within the European Union. They are organised in lobby groups, which are constantly, of course, in the ears of the governments of the European Union and of the European Union Commission, the kind of permanent public service leadership that dominates the European Union at the present time. Currently, they are trying to push through what is called the Treaty of Lisbon. It's a new European Union treaty between the 27 countries. We have to vote on that in Ireland, a vote of the people by referendum on the 2nd of October. But what the Lisbon Treaty is about is a strengthening of the neoliberal agenda to make it easier to privatise in the future, and an extension of militarisation, and in fact a putting of the armaments industry for the first time, giving it a treaty base within the European Union and demanding more military spending and more research on armaments. Now, in Ireland, as a matter of fact, we voted on this last year. The people voted. We had a major campaign after a major discussion that went on for months. We, the Socialist Party in Ireland, played a very important role opposing that treaty from a left-wing perspective, and we won. We defeated the treaty, but the very next day, the demands began to emerge from all the establishment throughout the European Union and the big business enterprises in Ireland that we didn't get it right. How dare the Irish people throw a spanner in the works of this major European project? You have to vote again, they said. And sure enough, we have a vote on exactly the same treaty on the 2nd of October. And this time we are told we better get it right. So that's the real situation of democracy within the European Union at the present time. Now, in Europe as well, like in the United States, we have the banks being bailed out at the expense of the taxpayers. And we have this huge attack on public services and on living standards. But undoubtedly, the struggles and the opposition of working people are intensifying. But it is only at the beginning. We have had a very difficult 20 years as socialist activists and activists in the labour movement in Europe, where we have been on the back foot, quite frankly, where many of these programmes and proposals of the establishment were enabled to be put in place without a meaningful fight back in reality by significant sections of the working class. But that is now beginning to change. The occupation in Dublin by those workers indicates an anger. We've had 500 workers in the Waterford glass plant, which many Americans would know, in Waterford, occupied for a period of months in opposition to a dramatic attempt to close that plant. And in particular, I think in England, in Britain, we've had the highlight, in my view, of the opposition over the past period of time, has been when thousands of engineering workers at power stations and oil refineries walked out in sometimes wildcat action and then official action in response to the activities of the Total, major multinational oil corporation, which essentially was trying to replace permanent workers on the negotiated rates for the job with migrant workers who were brought in deliberately by the company to replace those permanent workers, in other words, to try and drive down in the industry as a whole the wages and the conditions within that industry in Britain. But from January, in a series of actions related to the actions of the management, we've had a magnificent struggle, and brilliantly as well, but largely as a result of the intervention of our sister party, the Socialist Party in England and Wales. That opposition by the British workers was not directed against the migrant workers who were attempted to be used to drive down their wages and conditions, but was conducted in a way to embrace the migrant workers and for their rights as well as the rights of the permanent workers who were of a British origin. And that culminated a few weeks ago, again, in the last phase of this part of the battle, in thousands of workers in over 20 oil refineries and power plants walking off the job in opposition to the sacking of 640 workers by Total because simply they wouldn't walk away and take this idea that their job was gone while other cheaper labourers were being brought in. And that struggle has resulted now in a complete victory for the working class and a complete backdown by Total. That is, I cannot emphasise the importance of that victory, because the working class as a whole has been somewhat on the back foot, and it's victories like this which show that they do not have to be, that we have to rediscover the history of struggle that characterises our movement over many decades, and the history of the fact that any conditions and wages and protection that we enjoy or that we have at the present time were only won, and the same is true in the United States, as a result of hard united struggle and organisation by workers in opposition to what was attempted to be foisted upon them. Now, I'll go quickly. In France, as the chairman said, Teddy, we've had some major mobilisations against the policies of Sarkozy, the neoliberal president, even to the point of workers in a number of enterprises actually kidnapping their bosses, locking them in their places of employment and refusing to let them go or to let the police in to get them until their demands were met. In Greece, we've had a mass revolt of the youth, which would be well worth your while reading up on in the internet, etc. I wouldn't have time to go into it in great detail. It was just sparked off by the killing by police, the shooting by police of a young student, but really the background to this revolt of open, massive mobilisations of youth in opposition to the Greek establishment was fuelled by youth unemployment and by the dead end, really, that Greek capitalism is offering working class people at the present time within the constraints of its system. So we've had in quite a number of countries instances like that. Now, it is the beginning in many ways, but it is a vital beginning. But it raises here what is the critical issue for us in Ireland, in Europe, and I think probably in the United States, which is the question of the leadership of the labour movement and of the working class at the present time. Because, unfortunately, for a period of decades now, certainly in Europe, while the bosses and the corporate leaders were very clear and blunt on the programme that they wanted to drive through for the maximisation of their profit, which means the downgrading of social services and of the idea of the social side of society, while they were very clear in driving that programme through quite ruthlessly, the official leadership of the labour movement and the trade unions in particular were capitulating all the way. Instead of organising and mobilising in response, and with the same determination from the point of view of working people and our communities, they capitulated to this whole idea of the capitalist market, of competition, of the domination of the major corporations. And we have lost, we have been thrown back a lot. And we've had many, many instances where it was very clear that the workers who were at the brunt of these attacks wanted to fight. But unfortunately, their fight was disorganised, or not organised at all, by those who are paid and put in positions of leadership. And in Ireland, we have to say, what I say now quite publicly in Ireland, is that we don't know where the union leaders have gone. They've gone underground, they've gone into hiding in front of this catastrophic situation at the present time. And therefore, this whole question is going to become a vital one in the immediate period ahead, because really we are only at the beginning of this process of onslaught and attack. The programme in Ireland is for 4 or 5 years of the type of cuts that the Irish Times was indicating there a few weeks ago. A 4 or a 5 year programme of cuts after cuts after cuts. In other words, our public services and many other aspects of society, if they were successful, will be destroyed in that period of time if society doesn't stand up and the working class doesn't stand up and oppose and defeat it. And similarly in Europe, because the whole thrust of the establishment internationally is that it's the working class people who must pay for the crisis of their system by driving down the wages and the conditions, hoping that they can crawl out of the hole that they're in, put the wagon back on the rails, and then continue business as usual after that. But of course, as we point out in Ireland, this programme of cuts will in fact have a further catastrophic effect on the economy itself. Because if you cut the wages and the living standards of ordinary workers, then of course you cut their ability to buy goods and services, which means that the thousands of workers who provide such goods and services are also thrown onto the dole. And you know, we had this rubbish of propaganda in even the publicly owned media in Ireland in the early days, which means in the 6 or 7 months ago, in the early days of the onslaught of the crisis, where they were suggesting that workers should be happy to take pay cuts, that it was a patriotic duty to take pay cuts in solidarity with those who were losing their jobs. What absolute rubbish! The patriotic or the solidarity would have been to stand up and fight against every single pay cut, because in that way you're protecting the ability of workers to buy, which means you're protecting those who supply what they buy and supply the goods. So the programme of cuts and slash and burn, in fact, is going to have the opposite effect rather than bringing the economies in Ireland and indeed in other countries in Europe out of the present situation. So we have no faith in these bailouts. We have no faith in this programme of capitalism at the present time. And I was just struck by the fact that even modest reforms like the health bill that's being discussed here and Obama's programme is already being obstructed by corporate and various interests. And Obama is retreating as rapidly as could be in front of this. And that's exactly what's going on everywhere. So we need now an independent struggle by workers to oppose the layoffs, oppose the closures, and to demand an entirely different programme. And I'll finish on this point. We do have to stand up and arm our movement first with the idea that it is necessary to struggle, to organise and to struggle and to fight. And for that, workers are going to need to renew their basic organisations, to take back democratic control of their unions and other organisations in order to give them the vehicle to conduct that fight back. The second point is we need to challenge capitalism itself. What we demand in Ireland is not the bailout of the banks and the developers, but the nationalisation of the banks and developers. Not, however, like happened in a number of cases where it was simply used to bail them out and to fund, if you like, the speculation. But nationalisation, taking the banks into public ownership, but under democratic control, so that the investment policies are then directed on social need, on investment to create jobs, on investment for environmental projects, right across the board. That is fundamental to a new programme to transform our economies. The banks, the financial institutions end this type of gambling, the international gambling on the stock exchanges and on the finance markets of the world. It is quite incredible that the whole pension regimes of millions of workers has for a decade been riding on the financial gambling houses that are the stock exchanges of the world. And when they crash, that workers who have struggled all their lives and made sacrifices to put money aside for their elderly and retired years are now left high and dry. That certainly is the situation in Ireland at the present time. We want the banks in public ownership, democratic control to end that. We say public ownership as well of major corporations under workers' control and democracy. In that way, we can plan our economy, both on a national basis, but critically also on an international basis. And in the context of the debate that we are having in Ireland at the present time on the Lisbon Treaty and the strengthening of the armaments industry, we say the armaments industry should be scrapped, that this obscenity of millions, billions, trillions of dollars and euros wasted on armaments, of arms of mass destruction, that needs to be transformed instead into an industry that is promoting useful social projects. That itself would have a huge impact in relation to the world economy and in changing things around. So, dear friends, I think we are entering into a period when many of these issues and ideas will come very, very concretely onto the agenda. Unlike anything we've seen in the last decades, when frankly for the ideas of socialism and radical ideas of a new and different kind of society, it has been a difficult time. The tide has turned, and now millions of people are far, far more willing to listen to our ideas. That was why in the capital city in Dublin, we were able to beat, as Teddy outlined, the main capitalist establishment party to win a seat in the European Parliament. We knocked them out of the race, despite the fact that they would have spent $250,000 on that particular election campaign. We had $35,000 at our disposal to conduct that campaign. But because of ideas and because of representing the anger and the aspirations of the working class people and the youth and those who are disgusted with the way things are going, then we were victorious in that particular context. That is the music of the future, really, I believe, as far as society is concerned, and not just in Ireland or Europe, but also in the United States itself. You know, I came first to the United States to live for a period of years in the late 1960s, at the height of the anti-Vietnam War campaign, which did affect me quite dramatically at that time. But millions of youth in the United States were radicalised. I was part of that process at that time, and then a radicalisation that extended into society itself in general at that time. And that, of course, together with the huge opposition of the Vietnamese people, was what ended that war. But I think that the economic war that is now going on an international basis, and the international economic assault on the hundreds of millions of ordinary people, is really what is going to spark a huge change in attitudes and in ideas, and opening people's minds up to the idea that society does need to be changed, that there are better ways and must be better ways to run our society, to achieve a level of comfort, of security, of happiness for human beings, of environmental protection, and all the other issues that we would cherish in the type of world that we would want. We are going into a period when people will be listening to those ideas, and therefore it is the right time for socialists to be bold and forward in recruiting supporters to those ideas, in building a movement and building a leadership that will be able to take society forward in the challenging years ahead. Thank you.
Not only the country, but the entirety of the world right now.
Okay, I'll let Joe answer the questions that are in place right now, and then we'll go into a second round.
Well, we've varied very widely indeed, and I could probably only touch on some of the questions, but when we finish the meeting, if I'll be hanging around for anybody who wants to clarify, or we can continue the discussion informally. Just in regard to the electoral system in Ireland, which you raised there, undoubtedly it does help smaller parties and it helps the left. It's called proportional representation, which means that smaller groups can get representation provided you get a certain basic level of support. It's complex in the way it works itself out. But in the case of the European election in the Dublin constituency on 5th of June last, it was crucial. Now, Dublin, which is the capital, probably about 1.3 million people, sends 3 deputies, 3 elected people to Brussels or Strasbourg, to the European Union Parliament. And all the major parties, of course, were in fighting for the seats, the establishment parties, as was Sinn Féin, as was the Green Party, and as was ourselves, the Socialist Party, and a number of independents. Now, in the first result, the first count of the first preferences, because when you vote number 1 for your favourite candidate, the person you want most to support, but then you can go on and give us a number 2 to the next candidate that you think might be closest to your views, and then you can go on 3, 4, 5, etc. if you wish. You don't have to. But in the first count, I would have got just somewhat over 50,000 votes. Then you go through a process where the lower candidates are eliminated from the race, and then the officials look at who is the number 2 on their papers that are eliminated, and we get that support. So I would have got thousands of votes, for example, transferred to me from independent candidates who went out. And then in the last and final count, two people had been elected, one from the Labour Party and one from a party called Fine Gael, which is the second capitalist party in Ireland, unfortunately. But there was one seat left to be filled, then the third seat, and there were just 3 people standing: the Fianna Fáil candidate, myself, and the Sinn Féin candidate. Now, because the Fianna Fáil candidate was a few thousand votes over me, I was then, and the Sinn Féin candidate was maybe at that stage on 48, 49,000 votes, somewhat behind me. She was then eliminated, and her preferences then came into play. And I would have got a massive transfer from her because it would have been a kind of an opposition vote, and that would have put me ahead to beat the Fianna Fáil candidate by about 5,000 votes. So what it means is, rather than the first past the post winning, that all the votes are taken into account. And it is, for us, for the left, it's a better system, quite frankly. And we would fight to defend that. There were attempts over the decades by Fianna Fáil, the main party, to change that to a first-past-the-post system, because that means that they would have got far more power and people elected. But anyway, that's now these elections mainly reflected a massive rejection. We had elections to the councils, the local councils, on the same day as the European Parliament elections. What the results reflected in general was a massive anger and rejection of the ruling government party, Fianna Fáil, and the Green Party, and I'll come on to that in a minute, who are in government with Fianna Fáil, actually. And the parties that are in opposition in Parliament, for example, the Labour Party and Fine Gael, the second capitalist party, benefit hugely. Now, unfortunately, if we analyse what they stand for, it's not too different from what Fianna Fáil stands for, but they're not in government, so people kind of use a vote for them because they're nationally recognised leaders, etc., from the media, etc., to make a protest against the ruling party. But the left did well. I mean, we in the Socialist Party, we elected 3 councillors in Dublin, 5 councillors overall, and other left organisations elected another 6 or 7 councillors, which is encouraging. And is a definite basis for building more powerful representational positions in the period that we are going into. Now, it is true throughout the European Union, in a number of countries, the right gained, and unfortunately in some countries, the far right gained as well. For example, in Britain, the far right, the British National Party, which is a semi-fascist organisation, if you like, elected 2 people to the European Parliament. But really the reason for that is not that the people voting for them are fascists, but it's a rejection, an anger against all the established parties, and the fact that the left isn't strong enough, and particularly the leadership of the trade unions and the labour movement aren't showing a way forward. And in government in Britain, as you probably know, is the Labour Party, which the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, was George Bush's best buddy, going in and laying waste to Iraq, for example. And the British Labour Party carried through to its end the programme, the economic programme of Thatcher and the Tory party of neoliberalism. So is it any wonder that you'd have confusion and anger among the working class in Britain, which traditionally voted Labour? And unfortunately, in a mistaken protest, if you like, some voters even turned to the far right. Now, in other countries, like in Portugal, for example, the left made strong gains, and it was a mixed picture within Europe. But really, one of the challenges that faces us in Europe, and it's similar in the United States, is, you see, all the Labour parties and the social democratic parties, like in Germany and other countries, which were powerful organisations of the working class with tens of millions of votes, all of them without exception have gone into the camp of the right, of neoliberalism and of the market economy. And they are administering now the cuts, for example, where they are in power. So what were set up 100 years ago and 90 years ago as fighting organisations of the working class to represent working class people and to represent a different politics and economics, unfortunately have become the opposite and are part of the establishment. And in Ireland and in Europe, what that leaves us with is a huge vacuum, which isn't filled, unfortunately, by us wishing that it were filled or just declaring that we want to fill it, because there is confusion about who people should vote for, etc. So we, as well as building the forces of the Socialist Party, which we are doing very strongly, but we are also calling for the development of a new mass party of working people. And we are calling on the trade union ranks and activists in the unions to consider this issue. And we will be trying to take initiatives over the next year, 2, 3, to try and replicate, in a sense, what happened 90 and 100 years ago, where from the ranks of the movement, a new mass party that can be an alternative emerges. We are not putting conditions on that party that they should agree with every dot in common with our socialist programme. We want it to be a party of the left, opposition to the present system, and for a different democratic socialist society. And that will be one of the political processes, I believe, that we will see as a result of the debates and the discussions that are now opening up in response to this crisis. The need for a new political representation on the left of a mass character will definitely come into the discussion, I think, quite strongly. Now, in Ireland, in the capital city, in the European elections and in the local elections, we, the Socialist Party, we fought on our record. I haven't time to go into it, but we have a very strong record going back for 20 years of standing and fighting with working people on different issues. and not compromising and going behind their backs and all the stuff that the cynical establishment politicians do, but standing honestly and uncompromisingly alongside people who are struggling for different issues, for justice, etc. So we stood on our record, and that told with people. Opposition to the cuts and the crisis at the present time, but we also stood on. We don't hide our socialist policies. If you look at our election literature, we say exactly what we are. And on that basis, we were elected. Now, that raises just a number of issues. The question of socialism, the question of the former Stalinist states, the European Union, the question of the Greens, etc. Now, of course, we carry the burden of Stalinism still. And the nightmare obscenity that Stalinism was, this massive perversion that developed in Russia and in Eastern Europe, which of course wasn't socialism whatsoever. The only way that Stalin and Stalin's bureaucracy was able to take control in the 20s and the 30s particularly was by slaughtering the genuine socialists within Russian society who stood for democracy. And democracy, as Leon Trotsky said, is as essential to socialism as oxygen is to the human body. And without democracy, socialism, isn't socialism, it becomes a monstrous bureaucracy, and then serves the interests of that bureaucracy. And that's what happened in Russia. But they were only able to establish that after they had literally slaughtered, including many of the old Bolsheviks, the workers who heroically fought in 1917 against the landlordism and capitalism, and established the first worker state on the face of the world. And it is a tired old cliche now, really. When I was in the Parliament for 10 years in Dublin, and when you were attacking them, you know, which I was doing, let's face it, 100% of the time, you had to. The tired old response, instead of answering your arguments, they try and bring down something about Russia and the gulags and the concentration camps, etc., etc. But to be honest, it doesn't really wash anymore. I mean, the youth, today's youth, have no memory really of Stalinism, but all the workers have. And of course, naturally, they would be concerned about it because, you see, Stalinism was a gift to capitalism, because they could hold up and say to workers in the West, is that what you want? A system where you don't even have basic trade union rights, which was the case. But that's gone. So all we can do is to say we fundamentally stand for workers, for socialism, which inherent in that is the widest democratic rights of working people, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth.